translators. Please put your hands together to welcome them.
Thank you, Meg. It is always a pleasure to be here at Kitab Khana, this wonderful bookstore. And I'm really happy to welcome you all to the launch of a very significant collection. In Praise of Bone is a collection that brings together 30 years of Anand's work. And poems written between 1991 and 2021. And in these 30 years, Anand's writing has gone through multiple evolutions, but some things have not changed. So I will, as Dr. Ravi Shankar says in the introduction, and I quote here, in the introduction to this wonderful book, he quotes the 18th century poet Alexander Pope, and he says, Anand shows himself to be, I quote, darkly wise and rudely great. He also says, Anand inherits the mantle of those great formalists among English language poets, for whom prosody is a serious business, and intricately built scaffolding upon which to fix thoughts against the flux and ravages of time. In an age of free verse, this is certainly rare, and I'm really happy that we are launching this wonderful new book, which is published by Speaking Tiger, and I'm sure that it's going to further enhance Anand Thakore's reputation as a very significant poet writing in English in India today. So, congratulations, Anand.
Thank you, Menka. I don't know about being wise and great, but rude I am definitely known to be. So
Definitely.
If he says rudely great, I mean, there's some truth in that. But I'm going to ask you to unveil this book for me, and we can do it together. Yeah?
And I think we should stand for this very important
Yes, we shall
moment.
stand.
Congratulations.
Thank you, ma'am.
And I'm happy to see that people in the audience have already bought copies, so I would encourage the others who have not yet got their copy, before they run out, get it now. All right, get it after the conversation. So I had several questions for Anand. So Anand, you were 23 when you wrote the title poem. And at that time you were studying MA in English literature and you were studying Hindustani classical music. I was wondering where poetry fitted into all this and who were the poets who influenced you both in terms of the classical poets you read and in terms of the contemporary writers.
Okay, I see influence, I think, in three ways. First of all, I'm reminded of a critic whom I was very fond of reading at 23 called Harold Bloom, and years later met in New York. He wrote about the anxiety of influence, how all poets and all artists really are influenced by earlier practitioners, and they feel a huge anxiety at once to emulate and not to imitate and to be themselves, the pressure. So in that context, there are three kinds of influence really. The first is directly from what I read. Mm-hmm. So that starts, of course, with what I read as a child, and then in school, Shakespeare and Shelley, and very importantly, pre-20th century influences. Then a huge array of poets in the Oxford Book of American Verse and British poets. And by 23, I had read a lot of those, and yes, influence, but there's another kind of influence, which is comes from the direct human interaction with other practitioners. One is influenced by what other poets have said about one's work or are saying about poetry, what they are saying about it. So there's I have to think of just now Geef Patel telling me that, music and poetry is not an either-or situation for you. You can do both things, and being a living practitioner of two art forms as a painter and a poet, that was a very encouraging influence.
Right.
A little after 23, maybe 25 or so, but and many others like that. There was a phase in which I wanted to emulate Dom because I saw his neoclassicism as something very appealing and which fitted into what I was studying as a musician. But thankfully, I got out of that phase, and that was a relief. Adil Jasawala's later poems in Missing Person, which deal with myth and history, were an important influence, just to the extent that I felt I wanted to do something with myth and history. And at that time, specifically Indian myth and history, but that was also that scope has been widening in my life. There are many poets I can think of, Arvind Mehrotra, Arundhati, Ranjit, people in my own generation, you. And there's a third kind of influence, which is the overall ethos I grew up in. So I cannot say that Bombay and Birmingham are not major influences in making me what I am. Dom has a line in a poem in which he says, he asks, have these things shaped me for the craft of verse? And Hindustani music has, in its own way. Bombay has. Few years of my childhood in England have, amongst many other things.
Right,
so
right.
I have to see that as if I bow down to the things that make this possible for me. It's all that.
And Anand is one of the rare people who is reading Iliad at the age of 14, not because he had to in class, but because he wanted to. It was something he was doing in his break in school. So, Anand, this book contains 30 years of your writing, and you have gone through many, many evolutions during this time. So, putting together a collection like this would have been a very difficult task, I should imagine. You call it the darkest forms of retrospection being involved.
Yes.
So, what were you looking for when you were selecting the poems that now you'd now like to be represented by?
Yeah, and in the introduction, I used the image of Prospero in The Tempest asking his daughter, how far back can you remember, And I think as poets, we are unduly hard on ourselves and self-dismissive. It's very hard. I actually say something there about how I found very little worth keeping, worth preservation. Mm-hmm. And all right, maybe I'm just being hard on myself the way many artists are. What in all this is really worth selecting? But without slipping into that tone too much of self-dismissal, what I looked for as a criterion was whether any individual poem worked as a linguistic construct, as a well-wrought urn, to quote Cleanth Brooks, a thing made out of language that was worth preserving, irrespective of my emotional involvement in it or my autobiographical concerns at that time. Mm-hmm. Is it reasonably good writing worth keeping? And I think that is an important distinction, because one might have written a lot just because you needed to do it back then.
Right.
On the other hand, when you're judging yourself at the evaluatory form of self-judgment, hey, one can one can be totally deluded, about one's own work. What is the best and what is not the best, and who is to decide all this? And I think we did our best at that time, so, we should give ourselves a hand for it when we're looking back.
I think you also brought a lot of reading and craft and thought into the whole process, which is what makes it a really strong collection in my view. And I've also noticed that in your work, there are two threads that come across throughout, which is, and you've referred to this as being, celebrating the subliminal structures of things. That's your phrase. And your fascination with death. So, you say that these are at the core of your lyrical attempts. So, is this something that has remained unchanged through the years? If not, how has it evolved? What is it, how is it manifested in different stages of your life? Is this something you've thought about?
It's a very interesting question, Menka. But it has two dimensions to it, so I'll look at both. The first is this: both things have always been there, but they have been there in different ways. The search for what is beneath the surface, the structure beneath the surface, which in the case of the human body is skeleton, bone. Which also applied to me as a musician when I, distinguished between my improvisation and the essential structure of a rag, for instance. But that's beside the point. So that and also the fascination with death. The two things are related, but I will not try to relate them just now. I will look at them separately. This fascination with death, in Seven Deaths and Four Scrolls,
right,
the whole book is unified by the theme of death. Now, death is really a very expansive theme. It's a huge theme, like love. You can throw anything into a basket and say it's about love or death. But each of those poems deal with a specific death. So I called it Seven Deaths and Four Scrolls, and 7 monologues that deal with death and the ghosts of dead people speaking aloud. 4 scrolls written by the ghost of a Tibetan monk who committed suicide, a Buddhist monk who committed suicide. Now when I look back at that, I can see how my treatment of death over there is mystical, metaphysical, and very, not just otherworldly. It's not that. It's rooted in this world and experience in this world. But there's an otherness.
Right, right.
This is somebody else's story I'm telling. I'm not a Tibetan monk who committed suicide. I'm not a terrorist who was hanged. I'm not the ghost of a terrorist who's, revisiting his relatives in Pakistan. These are things these people could not say in their lives. Therefore, as a poet, I feel like I need to fill in a gap. Suddenly, there's a change in my attitude to death. And this happens as you grow older and you realize that death is not just a rag to sing. He's your next door neighbor. People you grew up with, people you knew, people you spoke to, and have just gone. And then death becomes a much more real presence. Right. And it's I am involved. Yes, the ghosts are there, but they are ghosts of people I have touched and I have known. And that's there in Seven Deaths too, but it's not immediate. It's not the immediate. So I'm going to respond to this with 2 poems, I think, from both collections. I will read maybe the last scroll from Buddhist Monk Hangs Self.
For whoever's got the book, what page is that?
One sec. 52. Now, this is a situation in which the spirit of the Buddhist monk who committed suicide is trapped, as it were, in a phase between one birth and the next. And there is this idea that if you die a particular kind of death, you are likely to be reborn as a lower form of life. Scroll 4. Because being human is more than I have deserved, and to exist is to want something, even in this dimension, I request to be reborn amongst the higher mammals. For to desire is to survive, though I know better now than to place my trust in the prayer of the will, to believe that some range of possible assorted births might lie before one simultaneously for one's own choosing, as shirts once seemed to hang in shopping arcades. Though I am here to surrender the myth of choice, let the fleshless voice that I am wish on while it can. No, not for the wings of mountain eagles, nor, though both have been considered, for the serpent's infinite flexibility, only to be born amongst herds of wild elephants, deer or bison, amongst panthers or whales. For this, because desire is survival, I pray. Make me less than human, but warm-blooded for sure. Let gravity draw me as a single maternal growl from the throat of a mountain bear draws to her breasts her newborn cubs. Receive me, Earth. I lose sight of myself and feel your sudden weight. As opposed to that, I will read to you a recent sonnet. It's called That's How It Feels, which is on
Page 11.
page 11. Sorry. That's how it feels. You claimed you preferred the safety of public spaces, to appear at bookstores, a park, a hotel pool. I had grown attuned to your frequent assaults on sleep, till late last night you chose to blast the rule and accost me in a room where only you could see me. Your eyes held mine with a stare hell-bent on slaughter. I recall a feverish ripping of shirts, the pressure of nails on astonished skin, but little thereafter, except the sound of the flesh crying out for more. When you bit my lips, I'm certain they bled. You loosened your grip, then rose and reached for the door. A salt lamp quivered in the dark. There, you said. I told you one day you'd get what you've always longed for. That's how it feels to get fucked awake by the dead. So
That was amazing, Anand. Anand always brings magic to whatever he reads. And this...
it's like how even the dreams grow so much more real as you grow older, because death is now not just a song you sing, you know. It's
Right, right.
I mean, I'm overstating it. It depends when this happens to you in life.
Of course.
It could happen at 14 for somebody.
Of course.
It didn't for me.
Just to tell you a little about the structure of the book now that Anand has read, a recent poem as well as an earlier piece of work, it begins with his newer poems. So the first set of poems in this book is from 2015 to 2021. And then it goes backwards. So speaking of going backwards, I wanted to ask you about the element of history in your work. You know, history is a very important aspect of your poems. And in fact, Adil Jassawala talked about this in 2012. I'll just quote this. Adil Jassawala said that while contemporary poetry abounds in poems on historical subjects, he had not read anything as ambitious and evocative as Babar after the victory at Khanua. So what is the importance of the past and how it can shape the present and the future, according to you?
Well, I'm not in my poetry looking for lessons we can learn from the past and all that consciously. What I am interested in is the contemporaneity of the past and how through art we can distance ourselves from the present while examining the present. For instance, I'm going to respond to this with two poems.
Okay.
Let me just think. Yes, I think these. We have a colonial history. What is the past of the English language here? Why am I using the English language? And how is this, it has a, the poem I'm thinking of reading is called Nocturne at Afghan Church.
Wonderful.
It's also a sonnet. Why are we writing sonnets at all in the Indian subcontinent? Why are we thinking in terms of European forms? Because there is a history to this. The history of the English language, which now bubbles on my tongue, is deeply connected with places like Bombay, with places like churches and colonial buildings. So maybe I'll just read this poem first before we discuss this. It's by no means the only aspect of history that fascinates me. Mughal history fascinates me. The Renaissance fascinates me. European and British history fascinates me. And I want to look more westwards now.
And you talked of Mongolian history as well.
Well, not really.
No?
Not really, but I respond to art from all over the world,
Okay.
you see. I can respond to a Japanese print, but I'm aware I recently wrote a poem about a Chinese landscape, an 11th century Chinese landscape. It took me 2 years to write that poem and look at it almost every day because I felt I did not know enough about this culture in order to really say anything about it. So then I talked about I had to find my entry point into this. It cannot be a Chinese entry point.
Right, of course.
In which certain things are understood. There's also writing in the painting, for instance. But anyhow, this is by the way. We are talking more about geography now than history. But the two things are connected. This poem is about the English language taking root in places like Afghan Church, but it's also about defeat. And I'll read the epigraph. Built in Mumbai in 1858 to honor the British soldiers who died in the campaigns against Afghanistan, a territory that was never successfully annexed to the British Empire. This is Afghan Church. And this is a building erected in praise of a glorious defeat. The sonnet I'm about to read was misunderstood by various scholars, scholarly fellow poets, as speaking about the contest between post-colonial users of English and users of English in America and, well, Britain. It's not that. It's about language in general and the human psyche, and the sense that however much control people who seek dominion over language exercise over it, in the end, this is a losing battle. There is something language is going to do that is beyond us, beyond our conscious knowledge. I'm getting too philosophical. This is a poetry evening.
It's page 13 of this book.
Nocturne at Afghan Church. Raised in remembrance of a war that could never be won, poised in silence against the dark they stand, spire and lamplit arch conspiring to sing, how the tongue I now speak took root in this land of mangoes, mangroves, lianas, and incessant heat. How sharp against the night their silence rings true, syllables of stone that praise a resplendent defeat, and the triumph of a language no tongue may subdue, whose defiant consonants and inscrutable cadence, victor and vanquished alike, shall never rein in. Syllables of stone that grow in silence immense, and presage our return to that emptiness wherein our efforts at speech pristinely begin. Against the tongues we speak, we are not born to win.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank
So,
you.
a poet who read this poem recently asked me, so who's we? And it is open to interpretation. I shouldn't be limiting it by my, but for me, we is, all of us actually, because we all use language and we all seek to control it. But it is definitely a poet's concern more than most people.
Yeah, you also have a poem called Sea Link, which is in fact on the page just before that. And
I have another historical poem to read before that.
All right.
Planned this.
Because then I want to go on
this
to
is again limited, as I was saying. For a long time, my exploration of history limited itself to the Indian context and at the most the colonial context. But then I found myself looking westwards again. And during the COVID crisis, when we were in this stage where a lot of us were feeling that maybe the world is coming to an end, and there was this sense of being locked in, not being able to go out, right? I thought of Constantinople in 1453. Now, they were in a situation with the Turks all around them. They were not able to go out of the city. And the Turkish conquest of Istanbul, which Western historians call the fall of Constantinople, was, and happened in 1453, was a similar sort of situation, because the walls of Constantinople were so high that no one inside could actually see what was going on outside.
Right.
So you had a body of people being hemmed in against an invisible enemy. We could not see the virus. We just didn't know where it was, except it's slightly different. But this is what I mean by the contemporaneity of history. Now, while people were sending poems all over the place saying called lockdown and COVID this and here, I suddenly think of Constantinople because I want artistic distance.
Right.
While talking about the immediate. History gives me this. It allows me to talk about what's happening right now through a different, in a different dimension.
I can't think of a single other poet who would relate COVID with Constantinople. I mean,
I'm sure they would, but Well, they would have found other things to relate with the past with. So I'm going to read this. The other thing is that these great walls were supposed to have been protected by the Virgin Mary. And so my poem is called Angelus of a Byzantine Courtesan, and it's basically a high-class hooker in Constantinople who's speaking to the Virgin Mary on the eve of the fall of Constantinople. One second. It's on page 20. Angelus of a Byzantine courtesan. Virgin Mary, have pity on us whores, on women sequestered in your city's exquisite bordellos, now too famished to work. Have pity on our pimps. The king's men hoard what little remains of our Genoese grain, and hunger now walks through our city with the face of a Turk. Our resilience dwindles, our bastards starve. A red moon rises over the Hagia Sophia, above the red apple, the Bosphorus, Galata, mocking our battlements, the few ships still moored in the Golden Horn. And Venice, for sure, has now abandoned us. Be with us through this night, lady, us vermin of the night. And if before morning, as now they surely will, the virgin gates of your city should finally give way to the pounding of battering ram and heathen cannonade, be still amongst us at that fall, and with those of this city whose stomachs still fatten on guarded wheat. And do not abandon those women whose disdain we have borne, who were married in your churches. We who were bred to feed alike on the varied hungers of Christian and Turk, appeasing each according to his special needs, are better prepared than most for what is now to come. You, lady, ravished by heaven, sentinel of stern walls, made fecund as you were through no choice of your own, would understand, possibly, better than most, the peculiar fortitude of our tribe. Be present for them when they are raped, mother, the women who scorned us. Be present for their sons when they are sodomized. Husbands, fathers, brothers brought in to watch. Inure them in time, as we have been, to the torment of enslavement and rape. Instruct them, mother, in the arts we were raised to study as children.
In fact, Anand, that's one thing I find really interesting about your work. You referred to the terrorists, you referred to other people who, populate your work. And through all this, I was wondering what is the relationship of the self in your poetry. And in fact, this is something that Dr. Ravi Shankar comments on in his introduction. He points out that shifting persona and diction, putting on different masks, Thakore reveals parts of himself that otherwise could not have been seen. So is this something you'd like to comment upon?
Well, it's an interesting question for me. By pretending to be a high-class hooker in Constantinople in 1453, am I saying something about myself that I would otherwise not say? I'm leaving this.
Or are you escaping yourself?
Or am I just escaping myself? Why don't I just say, listen, I'm a 21st century hooker who lives in Bombay, and this is me, this is who I am.
But there's the terrorist, there's the dancer,
There's the first person voice.
Mohenjo-daro.
I enjoy theatre. Essentially, the question is not about whether I'm being true to myself or not being true to myself. Arundhati Subramaniam tells me that she enjoys my poetry more when I don't have a dramatic character and I speak as a first-person I. And that is a legitimate response too, which I respect. But I enjoy theatre. I have always been a dramatic kind of person. So role-playing for me came very naturally. I wouldn't be myself if I didn't. And make it obvious to the other person that, this is Anand playing a role. Just now he's, whatever, being Pandit ji. Just now he's being this, just now he's being that. Whatever. So that worked itself very naturally into my poetry. I was influenced by poets like Tennyson, for instance, and Shakespeare, obviously. I mean, sure, those pre-20th century influences. I mean, what Hamlet comes on stage and says to the audiences, hey, I don't even want to go there just now, it's too strong. Those are our sources, right? If we read that at 14 or something. It can't happen if Shakespeare just says that. You have to have Hamlet saying that.
Right.
A character has to be created for that kind of poetry to be possible. So yeah, it's an open question.
And you've also been very influenced by art. You mentioned this earlier. And that shows in poems when you're talking about Kishankar, when you're talking about Chamba Valley miniature paintings, talk about Mongolian watercolors. So where does the art come into your work, and what is the impact it's made on your writing?
I started reading about art history and stuff like that at 14, again, and books like Kenneth Clark, and it's been a major interest for me, understanding visual art, over here. I'm not a scholar when it comes to that. I'm just a connoisseur, and I like what I like, and what doesn't work for me doesn't. Again, it's a lot of pre-20th century art over there that I respond to. But the interesting thing is, increasingly over the last few years, the time during which the new poems have been written, there's a tendency to respond to life through a construct that is already a response to life. What I mean is, there's this idea in Plato about the cave. We're not looking at reality, we're looking at shadows of reality inside. I'm responding to shadows and enjoying this. I'm enjoying this distance. So rather than talking about, kids celebrating Diwali on the streets of Bombay, I'm responding to a miniature painting of Diwali painted in the 18th century.
Right, but it's...
And enjoying this.
But you make the experience your own when you're writing.
Of course, it's poetry.
It's not just a second-hand thing.
Poetry, but the picture has already been painted. Now what happens in language? So I will read that poem about the miniature painting, which should be here somewhere. Diwali. Oh, thank you. I was always bad with numbers, page numbers and things. Yeah, it's a poem that deals with the brevity of a firework, but when you paint a firework, you are trying to give that brevity a form of permanence, and the paradox involved in that. Beautiful Kishangarh miniature. Also, importantly, we are no longer just talking about looking at original paintings. We are talking about looking at these paintings in books, on miniature painting, in prints, on the internet.
Right. Yeah.
So that plays a role in the poem also. So there are all these stages between me and life. Diwali on the palace roof, Kishangarh, 18th century. Where the light from my reading lamp falls on this open page, it is always Diwali night, and we have nothing to do but wait and watch while the palace concubines lift and wave lit sparklers to amuse us. Watch black and gold revive old questions, till gold betrays its transience, yielding to black. Each minuscule spark, frozen in paint, resigning itself in sudden contentment to the knowledge of its own brevity, coming gently to understand that night will have her way and must be allowed to. Where the light from this reading lamp falls on this open page, we begin to see that fire is just another game night likes to play, that this is true of each of us too, that we are aspects of the night, and night will have her way.
Amazing. And you read that poem earlier about Afghan church, Nocturne at Afghan church. You also have this poem, Sea Link. So while at one hand you're looking at history and you're looking at the past, the city also plays a very important role in your writing. Would you agree with that view?
Oh, absolutely. More in the recent past, though, than earlier. I mean, direct references to Bombay. When I was working on Dipankar Khivani's collected, the introduction to Dipankar's collected, a poet whom I actually went to school with and grew up with, and who died 3 years ago. I was going through his Bombay sequence, and it was very interesting because we grew up seeing Bombay together. We both grew up here in the same spaces, Cathedral School and college. And so Bombay became important, but what I began to feel more and more over there is that to belong to Bombay is not to belong. There is a sense that even if you've grown up here, you're from somewhere else. Even if your ancestors have been here for 3 generations.
It's a city of migrations.
Yes. And there is also no linguistic definition to what belonging to Bombay means. But that's a sort of academic, anthropological question. I don't want to get into that. This one is about belonging. The Sea Link connects one part of the island to another part of the island, but itself is not part of the island. It's a space on which everything has to keep moving. You can't just stop there and decide to have a picnic or something, or drink a beer or look at the view, and it's not allowed. So it stands alone, and yet it is part of, which is very much my relationship with this city. Sea Link. A swerve to the left, and at last I can see from outside the city I was raised in. At the edge of the village on my right, a finger of rock laid bare by an ebbing tide, the skyline retreating in darkness and halogen light. Surely the voice at once spoke true and lied, that said I belong to this city of slums and towers. There's a side of me that wants to cast aside what links us together to commonly call it ours. And bound to it in concrete this, our very own brand new sea link, remains inseverable from what I love and long to flee, though it claims to stand alone. Here none may linger, all must always move. It isn't true, but there's relief in pretending one is through, as taut white cables fly backwards above. In both these poems, the Afghan church poem and the sea link poem, I was also interested in the connection between the architectonics of the sonnet and architectural structures.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
Of course, they come from totally different periods, Afghan church and the sea link. But they're both pieces of architecture. And poetry needs to be a form of tonal architecture for me.
And while there is a lot of detail that brings the space alive, there are other truths that one may not immediately see if you're just looking at the structure. Those truths that belong to your poetry. And in fact, you just talked about writing a sonnet, and I was very interested in the fact that you have tried all these different forms, which today very few poets would try, for sonnets, nocturnes, dramatic monologues, different kinds of poetry that take a lot of understanding of structure and depth in terms of the reading involved that goes behind the writing of every poem. So my question to you is that you have that dramatic, you have that intensity, you have that poetic voice, you have the craft, and you have a lot of emotion in everything that you write. So how do you see that relationship between craft and emotion in your writing? And has that changed over the years?
There have been times, and there continue to be times, when craft is more important than emotion, and when emotion is more important than craft. But the essential distinction here is that emotion is something everyone has. Everyone experiences emotion. Everyone has emotion. Everyone does not have craft. What makes you a carpenter is your capacity to cut wood, not what you feel about carpentry. What makes you a poet is your capacity to do with language something that most people cannot do. What makes you a musician or a dancer or a painter is about the craft that you possess.
Right.
So, whereas in one's 20s, emotion seemed so important, in one's 50s, I think this happens to many poets, but let me not generalize. The craft actually seems far more important to me than my personal emotions. There cannot be poetry without emotion, because there cannot be human life without emotion. To feel is to move. To move is to feel. Even at the level of touch, for instance. Even touching something is a sensation. There is some emotion happening when you touch something, when you feel, when you lift. Right? So, but it's everywhere. It's in everyone sitting in this room. Is capable of emotion in their own way. Everyone is not capable of, sketching a face accurately. I am certainly not. I can't do that. I do not have the craft.
Right.
So, yeah.
I remember Nissim Ezekiel telling me when I was 16 that that was the age when I should perfect the craft of writing, so that when I'm not, when I'm writing poetry at a later stage, I've internalized the craft. I'm not even thinking about it anymore, and that's when the real poetry can happen. So even though you're not thinking about the craft, or, it's something that you have imbibed.
But I've had very interesting responses to this aspect. I mean, there are readers who say, Anand, I don't like your poetry so much when you are showing your craft. I like your poetry when the emotion is flowing. And they're extremely intelligent readers. They're not just,
Sure.
extremely intelligent people saying that in your case, this is how we feel. And there are the other kind who really enjoy the fact that I've, managed to put something together in 14 lines exactly. And
Do you want to read something that might illustrate this?
well, not really. These are just general responses I'm sharing, and I'm sure different people would receive my work. And what is craft? Hey, we can't be saying that writing sonnets and villanelles is craft, and writing extremely good free verse is not craft. It takes tremendous craft.
It's a very detailed.
Craft is about how convincingly, powerfully, and effectively and efficiently you employ language.
True.
Regardless of whether you do it this way or that way. Prose can be much better crafted than bad poetry, right? Good prose is better crafted than bad poetry. But let's not get into goods and bads just now.
Okay.
No.
So now, after how many years has it been? 30 years in this book and longer before that, right? So almost 40 years of writing, 35 years of writing. You've done a lot of different kinds of writing. You've written sequences, you've written villanelles, you've done a different kind of work over the years. And now you have talked about more often each poem for itself approach. You speak of how you began to sense the dangers inherent in a method, and I quote this from his introduction. He says, the dangers inherent in a method that has repeatedly pushed poetry towards drama and narrative prose. So I was wondering, what are these inherent dangers you're speaking of, and how did this transition happen? What is your process while writing a poem?
Okay, that's many questions at once.
They're
But
related,
I'll try and answer them. In terms of my own process, it has something to do with having written two books that are completely unified by a single theme, Mughal Sequence and 7 Deaths and 4 Scrolls. Mm-hmm. Nothing is allowed into the work that doesn't fit in with the essential rag or essential theme. In Mughal Sequence, there's a historical unity to it. In 7 Deaths and 4 Scrolls, death, which is a huge theme, it still plays a unifying role. All these poems are about death. So there's something that the whole book is about. I wanted to get out of this because I felt that whereas this is not a strategy to dismiss or anything, it has limitations. From the point of view of a lyric poet, mm-hmm. it tends to gradually make one's work less intense if it moves too much towards other forms. It moves away from the core lyrical attempt, let me put it this way, which is creating a construct that works independently of anything else. A good Urdu couplet can work even without its context in a ghazal, for instance. Mm-hmm. This is true of great English lyric poetry as well. It is very different from epic poetry. I mean, surely a small passage from an epic might have great value, but it belongs to a vast structure. Autobiographically, why? does this happen to me after writing these two books? Why do I feel now I don't want to create anything that needs to be seen in terms of a larger structure in order to be apprehended? I think it has something to do with feeling that life is not a 5-year plan, man. It's not a 10-year plan. It's just what you're going through now and how quickly you can give form and meaning to it. Mm-hmm. That is what lyric poetry has always been about. Epic and dramatic poetry, and I know I'm using the old Aristotelian distinctions over here, have not been about that. They are about creating something that society will relate to over many, many generations, etc., etc. And they're less concerned with immediate personal experience. The older one grows, the less one thinks in terms of larger structures and fitting into them, I think. Why am I generalizing? This is a personal journey.
Sure.
The older I grow, the less I think about life as, a novel. It's.
You used the word rag earlier in your response. So, where does the Hindustani music training fit into the writing of English poetry?
In many, many ways, which it would really be the subject of a separate discussion.
I'm sure.
But surely at a very simple level, the connection between temporality in Hindustani music and the need for temporal form in poetry, for me, the use of stanzaic forms and metrical forms is connected. There's something else that came to mind that I would like to share, if I haven't forgotten it. In the context of Hindustani music and rag, we all read The Wasteland, right, as students of
Yes.
literature. And I was intrigued by it, as I saw it as an innovation at a particular time, just around the time of the First World War, for a man to be looking at things in this completely disjunctive way. It is argued that The Wasteland also does have a theme, because the theme of The Wasteland is themelessness. So the rag is raglessness in that sense. This is the no rag of it. But I remember feeling, hey, this is not the kind of poetry. More and more as I grew up, I was very fragmented at 23 when I read The Wasteland. I was reading existential philosophy, and I was living alone in Pune in a little room. And I remember, I think falling in love makes you see a different picture of life. You suddenly start seeing sonnets instead of The Wasteland. Because they are wholesome. You can hold them, you can feel them, and they have shape, and the togetherness of it rather than the fragmentariness of it was important. And that's when the sense of fidelity to theme became important to me, and I started writing the sort of poetry seriously that I might actually show to other people as a, the way I did a small concert somewhere. Mm-hmm. Until then, I was just doing it for myself. It's the fidelity to the theme, that is where the rag comes in. Hindustani music does not permit you to go out of the rag.
Right.
There's something essentially that this poem is about, and it has to stay within that zone. A lot of modern poets do not believe in this, and they're perfectly entitled not to. And I enjoy their work very much.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But I found this was where I wanted to be.
Okay, I think we are now running out of time. So my last question to you, Anand. You've just put together this really significant collection. What next? Or is it too soon to ask?
It is too... You know what's next? Once you no longer have 5-year plans and 10-year plans and all that, what's next is your next possible poem and your next music session. And
and you never know when the next one will turn up.
it's on its way. I was working on it yesterday, so it's,
Wow.
it's happening. And I did my
That's
made a
good.
little music before coming here, and so it's not.
Would you like to read us a couple of poems?
I
and
would
then-
like to end with a poem in memory of my father, who passed away very, very recently, actually. It's about him being in hospital about 10 years ago when he was first diagnosed with mouth cancer, and me sitting out of the ICU just outside the ICU and feeling this very strong urge. I mean, something in my blood wants to leap at this point. There's something that wants to express itself, but I can't identify it. My father's mouth had been bandaged up, so he couldn't speak, and he was on the drip. So it was as if poetry was needed to articulate what this impulse is. He was a very musical person. He'd learnt sitar in his young days, and he was a serious amateur musician, a great nature lover and a photographer of wildlife. All these were his hobbies while he was not at Supreme Court. And the poem, embraces these sides of him. But it also strikes a connection between music and photography, which I would like to draw your attention to. It's called Waterhole. Waterhole. Something in the blood wants to leap. Here, outside the ICU my father's in. His speech now taken from him by bandages, tubes, and pipes. What wants to leap is like the sound and stroke of a bright steel plectrum against a taut-tuned string, the hollow russet gourd with its bridge of horn, leaf-decked and lacquered in Calcutta in his early teens, reverberating with the tiles of a mosaic floor, laid down at his grandfather's behest to allure the dead. An untamable sound, febrile, metallic, that reaches out not for perfection of pitch or form, but for the undergrowth of forests visited in solitude, between sessions at court or five-star hotels. It is a music that summons the jungle home, beseeching it to inhabit the domain of time-hallowed meters and arched ancestral walls once believed indomitable. Each creepered phrase, each verdurous pause, urging it to confer on territories of tone that have stood like temples, its uncontrollable strength. What longs to leap is impassioned as the sound of strings he tuned and strummed, pulled, plucked, and put aside for years. But also, it is as tuneless, aloof, and swift as the single click of a black and white camera, heard against the torrid crunch of desiccated leaf beds crumpled by hooves, amidst crane squawk, deer bark, cricket hum, and monkey screech, in the parched interior of a landlocked forest towards the end of March, when trees turn skeletal and all streams for miles around run dry, all pools but this one, his breath slowing down as he turns from the lens to the thought of thirst, and rows of antlers sail cautiously into view, till it is time to gather with those who have gathered, receiving what deer and buffalo receive, asking to live, here only for water. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Anand.
I'm now going to ask my dear friend Denzil to come on stage. One of the beautiful things about poetry is that, unlike Hindustani music, it is not trapped in the voice of the physical voice of the poet. It can lend itself to 100 voices, and in each voice, it acquires a new personality. So I am honored to have with me today Denzil Smith, the star of the Bombay stage. Denzil is an extremely well-known actor. Denzil,
Pleasure to have you.
Denzil is too famous an actor on the Bombay stage for me to have to introduce him here. But something people don't know about him is that he's one of the few actors who's been very closely in touch with some very important poets over the last 30 years. He has read their work in public, he has interacted with them. The list of poets whom Denzil has been friends with is long, and they're all the good poets. Sorry.
But it's really a pleasure to have you, Denzil. Thank you for joining
So
us.
I now I renounce my poetry and give it over to you.
I hope I do justice to it. So, the book of Anand, I think, begins like this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was death. So, in keeping with that, I shall read a poem called Death at the Opera Comique. 20 Rue de Grammont, 2nd Arrondissement, Paris, 17 July 1990. The Baroque caryatids would have been the last thing he saw. Tall, nonchalant women still content to bear the weight of a great florid building constructed for song. His hunky avuncular arms flying swiftly past a polished wooden nude from Haiti. A miniature from Ajmer poised against the open double-glazed windows of a terraced apartment that had served as servants' quarters for Josephine Bonaparte. He would have walked up the steps of his wooden loft, past his immaculate self-carpentered tool cabinet. The whole room with its acoustic flooring and the levered double bed upon which his fiancée lay asleep, self-designed. A huge, hairy-chested beast of a man, athletic and in his prime, unable, perhaps, suddenly, to trust an interior of his own meticulous making. Or seized by the horror of having to inhabit the human heart, the impossibility of it. Amidst the unreachable tranquility of objects, a 6-stringed tanpura in a corner by the fireplace, a Bavarian harp with a painted rose, amidst much we have no wish to think of that might have occurred. In the presence of baguettes and a bottle of Bordeaux, a 7th century Sarnath Buddha, a slice of camembert. The police reported an accidental fall at 4 a.m. outside the record store in the basement of the Opera Comique. we were told to believe what the police told us. 2. My mother returned to Mumbai with a pair of his finest red Rudolfo Valentino Italian leather shoes. I felt fear the first time I stepped into them, but wore them anyway, from one pubescent beer-drenched party to the next. I found the snakeskin buckles irresistible and came to feel, as I ran my fingers over them, a longing to dance, a growing numbness to the presence of death that compelled me to swirl. I had fire in my feet back then, though now, in my 40s, it makes me turn cold to think I partied through my teens in a dead man's footwear. Drinking myself stupid and dancing myself crazy, till I felt no fear of the dark that had seized him. We recover in time lost reverence for the dead. We forgive them their inability to look out of themselves. And as it grows harder to pretend, we shall never be amongst them. I see him dancing to the music of Zorba the Greek, with all the brisk turns and startling jumps, the intricate footwear, all held in place, as hard white plates whirl and crack about his feet, plummeting to smithereens against the mosaic floor of a Greek restaurant in the Latin Quarter. A middle-aged Parisian Gujarati devotee who spoke 9 languages and worked as an engineer. The dead must have their reasons to haunt us. We begin to receive them as we would the living. I like to leave him here, dancing.
Thank you, do we have time for one more? What's the time?
Meg is the boss here.
Okay.
So, thank you, Denzel. There's a request. Short poem.
Short poem? Yeah.
A short poem by, yeah.
One, yeah.
It's a great, to have Denzel here is really.
One more? Okay.
One more.
Okay.
A short one, probably.
This mic is a little bit booming. You can hear me, right? Yeah. The Kohinoor. It was finally forwarded to Queen Victoria, arriving in time to become the prize exhibit in the Great Exhibition of 1851. Bamba Gascoigne, the great Mughals. Here in this tower, bound by gold clamps to thin walls of gold, I, who am pure mineral, neither mortal nor ghost, remain doomed to abide. Of those who are sent here, only the living escape. I endure the doom of rock, inhabited by light and never at home. No, never, never for a minute since I was taken from the stomach of this earth. Except, perhaps, through the week I dreamed unguarded, unpraised and unpossessed, in the waistcoat pocket of a British lieutenant who thought me worthless. Most men who held me beheld only what I showed them, and I saw much that their pride could not begin to see. Though monarch and vassal alike, minion and minister, eunuch and page, cupbearer, concubine, courtesan and queen, only rarely guessed that I was watching. I have seen too many blindings, too many tremblings of oil lamps in mirrored paternal halls usurped by the young. The banishment of music and nervous weaving of recalcitrant cotton, where fountains had heaped and the peacock once danced, Too many orgies, too much opium, and too much penitence. Too many depraved flailings in the courtyards of mosques. And self-assured mastectomies of prurient goddesses by incensed, believing hands. To be moved or repulsed, intrigued or deceived. These things I have seen, and seen myself too often now, in the sculpted faces of mute attendants, while ailing emperors clung to me in their slumber, then woke before death, envious of my transparence, but unaware of my gaze. Staring right through me with opiate eyes, or eyes vermilion with wine. I, who have never cared to be a seer, have seen these things. And ask only now to be sheltered from the light that can never be mine. Return me to the mines. Carry me back to the dark that scorned me.
Thank you, Denzel. That was an absolutely wonderful end to this amazing conversation. And now we really are out of time, so unfortunately we will have to stop this conversation for now, but I'm sure Anand is going to be here for a few minutes to sign copies. So take full advantage, go get your copy and get him to sign it. Thank you for being here, everyone, and thank you, Kitab Khana. And it's wonderful to have been here. And congratulations, Anand.
Thank you.
That is so lovely.